Language, culture, and genes can travel together, but they can also travel apart. If I migrate, I'm going to carry my culture and my language with me, but my children may have a different language and culture. So these things change, and they don't necessarily change together, but they can travel together. So they're informative of each other, but they don't necessarily map onto each other one-to-one.
What we call the Proto-Indo-European language should have died thousands of years ago. But somehow, Proto-Indo-European lives on through its many descendant languages and through its place in some of our best-loved works of literature, including Dante's Inferno, the Rig Veda, the Lord of the Rings, and the love poetry of Rumi. How did this happen? My guest, acclaimed science journalist Laura Spinney, has ventured to answer this question in her newest book, Proto: How One Ancient Language Went Global. She's going to illuminate not only how this language moved across geographical borders, but also how it crossed the boundaries of academic domains of linguistics, archaeology, and genetics. Languages evolve with culture, necessity, mythology, and even the structures of the human body. In this interview, Laura Spinney will show us the prehistoric roots of our languages and their profound implications for our globalized world. Laura Spinney, what do you think is the biggest event of the last 5,000 years?
Well, I wrote in my book that in the old world, by which I meant Eurasia, the most important event was easily the emergence and spread of the Indo-European languages.
And what makes that so big?
Because that was the setting of the linguistic scene context in which we still live today, broadly speaking, especially in Europe. The Indo-European languages dominate, though they're not the only languages spoken there. And even if languages don't shape the way you see the world, the languages you speak are very much associated with the culture that you practice, and the languages you speak also shape, to some extent, the way that you think and believe.
How do you think it shapes the way that you think?
Because the language you speak this is a whole domain of research on its own, because there was a very famous theory called the Sapir-Whorf theory, which suggested that the language you speak controlled how you, sort of governed how you perceive. And nobody believes that anymore. But I think that the language, and by the way, there's a brilliant book on this written by Guy Deutscher called Through the Looking Glass. The language that you speak can direct your attention to different aspects of what's happening around you. And therefore, there are subtle differences in the way that we are conscious of our surroundings that are governed by the language we speak.
Yeah, this is very 1984. This is newspeak and having access to different words. And you briefly mentioned 1984 in your book. What do you think is the connection there?
Oh, look, I mean, language itself is incredibly powerful. Okay, so whether you are peddling the truth, a version of the facts as we all accept them, or false information, lies, is obviously crucial to the way that you're going to shape the thinking and behavior of others. But that's sort of separate from the discussion of which language you are peddling that truth or fake news in. 1984 comes in there. My reference to 1984 in the book was actually more to the ideas of its author, George Orwell, on the English language. He's had some ideas with which I don't agree, though I admire lots of his work and ideas, about he wanted to see English basically cleared out of all foreign clutter, by which he meant anything that wasn't Germanic in origin. You know, he wanted it to be purely a good old Anglo-Saxon language. Well, English, like every language, is the result of its history, the history of the people who have spoken it. And so, for example, the Norman imports, that came in after 1066 are, to my mind, as much a part of it as the Germanicisms that it started out with. And if you took them away, it would be a lesser language. So I was highlighting this point with an extract from 1984, just to show in this short passage how even George Orwell's own English was peppered with these so-called foreign imports, and he wouldn't have been able to say what he wanted to say without them.
What are some examples of those Norman imports, as you say?
So anything that came into English from Latin via French after 1066. So, I can't even think of an example, of course, but anything that is Romance in origin. Let's say, I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but defenestrate, which comes from fenêtre, which is French for window. And in English, of course, it means to push someone out of the window. So it's French in origin, but it's still an English word.
Yeah. And Latin by way of French. How important do you think Latin is? It's a dead language, but some people still say, if you want to be a doctor or an attorney or something, you need to understand Latin.
Latin is a huge influence in all the languages spoken in Europe and further afield, either directly from words that came in directly from Latin, because, for example, through the Roman invasions of Britain around the 1st century AD, or even earlier, and then also later on when Latin had itself ceased to be spoken as a vernacular but was being spoken as the Romance languages, of course then, as I referred to earlier, you get the French words coming in, but also words coming from other Romance languages, for example, Italian. So essentially, because of the huge sweep, size, and importance economically and politically of the Roman Empire, Latin has left a huge imprint on other languages spoken in Europe and further afield.
So, Laura, we've talked about language for communication, culture. It seems language also says something about belonging. What does it say about identity?
I mean, the language that I speak is a huge part of my identity, but it's not the only part of my identity. Identity is a complex sort of mosaic, I would say, in everyone. Maybe some people's identities are more complex than others, but your cultural identity might not be the same as your linguistic identity, which might not be the same as your ethnic identity, although ethnic is a bit of a woolly word. So you might think about somebody who grows up in, say, London, where I grew up, but whose parents were of, I don't know, South Asian origin, so their culture might be South Asian, Indian, and their ethnic identity might be a mix of English, South Asian, and anything else that came in along the way over, many centuries of generations of a family evolving. So I think we can be conscious of these different identities. They can sit quite comfortably within us, although they're different. And that becomes particularly pertinent in my story about a language that was never written down, because the linguistic identity of its speakers might not match up always with the same genetic and cultural identity.
And the conclusion of your book is titled Shibboleth or Shibboleth or Sibboleth. That's the trick of it, is that there are different ways to pronounce it.
Well, I suppose as an English speaker, we'd say Shibboleth, but it's originally a Hebrew word.
Yeah. So what are modern examples of a shibboleth?
Well, so I gave the example in the book of the code word that Ukrainian troops are currently using to identify more or less reliably, I don't know how reliable it is, but they consider it a test to identify undercover Russian agents, because Ukrainians and Russians pronounce this word differently. And the word in question is Paleogenetics. I'm not a linguist myself, so I don't know whose pronunciation that is or if it's correct to anyone, but Paleogenetics is how I would say it, and it means a loaf of bread, and it's pronounced differently in Ukrainian and Russian.
And so what does it look like as a test?
So, I mean, you might introduce it into a sentence and ask someone to say that sentence, and you would be able to tell from them the way they pronounce it whether they were Ukrainian or Russian.
And troops are doing this?
They're using it.
Spies?
And by the way, they also used it in the First World War, apparently, and the Second World War as a way to identify potential spies.
Yeah, it's like that. Have you seen that movie Inglourious Bastards?
Yes.
The three, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's a code word. It's a code word to differentiate between them and us.
Yeah. So with all this differentiation of them and us, your thesis seems to be that we're all quite connected when it comes to language too. I mean, what does that say if so many languages stem from this Proto-Indo-European root?
I mean, so I suppose that as you go about your daily life as an ordinary person who is not a linguist, you might think that your language is very, very different from other people's languages. I mean, a person who speaks only French wouldn't necessarily understand what a person who speaks only German was saying to them. And yet these two languages have a lot in common. They come from the same, they share a common ancestor. So the point is that even if you think that you are linguistically completely different from somebody who lives across the border, you have this shared history in common. Okay, 5,000 years ago sounds a lot to most of us. It's certainly a lot compared to the typical human lifespan, but it's nothing in the grand scheme of things in terms of humanity's existence. So linguistically, French and German, of course, all the other speakers of Indo-European languages, so going over to, the subcontinent of India, the Baltic, Slavic, Greek, Armenian, I can go through the 12 branches of the family. Speakers do all share this one common ancestor. And I think that says a lot to us about, again, how much we have in common rather than how much separates us. Because, especially in these times, so focused on the things that separate us in these polarized times, when in fact, probably much more joins us.
Another thing that people might use to separate, and the phrase Aryan comes up in your book and in these sort of studies is genetics. What role does genetics have in all of this?
Okay, so I mean, I think that the word Aryan needs to be some explanation first of all, since it's come up, because it's such an emotive word. Aryan is the word that ancient Indians and Persian people speaking Persian languages, Iranic languages, use to describe themselves. You see it, for example, in the Rig Veda, one of the oldest Indian and Hindu sacred texts. And it was really a cultural distinction. It was the word that was applied to those people who knew how to say the correct forms of words in a sacrificial ritual, and therefore to maintain a cosmic order, because sacrifice was a very important part of keeping things running smoothly in the ancient world, in that part of the ancient world. So it was very much a cultural distinction. And in the Rig Veda, for example, the Aryans are the arch enemies of the Dasyus, and the Dasyus were the people who didn't know the correct form of words to say these rituals, right? So possibly Aryans and Dasyus also spoke different languages, but they were obviously culturally different, but they weren't necessarily ethnically or biologically different. So it's important to say that at the outset. It was the Nazis who took that word and gave it a different meaning entirely. They basically kind of said that the Aryans were people who lived in northern Germany, who were blonde and blue-eyed and made pottery in a certain kind of way. And they were able to sort of make that sleight of hand switch, because they said that in fact the first Indo-European language, which was spoken by the Aryans, which was an idea that no longer holds water, but was popular in the Enlightenment, those people lived in northern Germany. So it doesn't hold with modern scientific thinking about where the first Indo-European languages were spoken, but it is a historical fact that the Nazis considered themselves Aryan, and therefore used that as a sort of excuse, if you like, for taking the land of their neighbors and, stretching their wings and claiming lands that didn't really belong to them.
So where does genetics come into your story?
If you're talking about trying to understand a language that was spoken in prehistoric times, that literally means before records began, before writing, before we had history, then you have no, by definition, written text to tell you what was going on then. And if you want to understand who those people were, where they lived, how they lived, where they moved, and what their relationships were with other people, then you can't turn to history, so you need to look at other sources. One very important other source is archaeology. When you talk about, we can come on to this, how you reconstruct ancient languages, but once you've reconstructed an ancient language, you'd quite like to know who spoke that language. And so you need to go to the archaeologists and ask, well, look, I think this language was spoken roughly in this time period. Who can you tell me was living in this part of the world then, and what can we say, and can we compare notes, because I have words meaning these kinds of concepts, referring to these kinds of concepts. Did the people who you study, who you've dug up from that time period, did they think about things in that way? What was their knowledge? What were their beliefs, and so on? And you can do this cross-referencing and try to understand who spoke what at what time. Where the genetics comes in is that genetics can tell you who was where when. You can trace genes through time and through space. That was quite difficult until about 20 years ago, or probably in a practical sense 10 years ago. In the last 20 years, essentially what has changed is that scientists have succeeded in extracting DNA from ancient human remains rather than modern human remains, which was possible before that, and to read that ancient DNA, to distinguish it from modern DNA, and to say, and therefore to track prehistoric migrations. And that's really important in this story, particularly because the splitting of languages in a language family tree often maps quite closely onto prehistoric migration routes. And that makes sense when you think about it, because as people move apart, like the migrants leave the original population, they take their dialects with them. That means that the dialects they carry separate from the dialects still spoken at home, and their dialects are going to come into contact with the languages spoken in the places they reach. So these forces will drive the evolution both of their language and of the one that remains at home, which is in contact with other languages. So it's migration which is still considered really the major force that drives language change, and certainly in the prehistoric world. Obviously, knowing about those prehistoric migration routes is a massive source of information about who spoke those languages when and why they were changing. And therefore, it really has transformed this story of trying to understand the origins and dispersal of the Indo-European languages in the last 10 or so years. And that's the reason I wanted to write my book now.
Yeah. So, Laura, what in the DNA is telling us actually who migrated from where it would seem that old DNA would be hard to tell who's younger, who's older, who was going from where, who's related.
Well, let me give you a sort of hypothetical example. You could dig up human remains in what is now Ukraine, and I don't select Ukraine completely at random because that is, with Russia, roughly the area we're talking about for the origins of these languages. And you can date the bones with radiocarbon dating. And then you can extract the DNA if enough of it is preserved. And you can read it and you can look at the makeup of the genomes of those ancient people. And then you can compare it, for example, to the DNA of people who are roughly the same age but were buried in a cemetery thousands of miles away. And you can see roughly how closely they're related they were. All of this is a sort of ideal scenario. You would hope that you can preserve enough DNA is preserved for you to get this amount of information out of it, but often you can. And then you can say, well, if people this closely related are buried in the cemeteries this far apart, there must have been a migration between them. It must have happened over this number of generations. But you can also say things like, you can see that people were related, let's say in Ireland, that they shared DNA with people who were buried in Ukraine 1,000 years earlier. And therefore, maybe the migration happened over a very long time frame and was much slower and more gradual and went through stages. There weren't direct relations, but the DNA was sort of making its way that way through a whole sequence of events, including smaller scale migrations perhaps, and mixings and marriages and wars and, people replacing other populations that were extinguished by pandemics, for example. That's also something that comes into my book. So by the normal natural processes that shape populations, if you can trace the DNA through them, you can, and since people tend to carry their languages with them when they move, at least for a time, you have a source of information about where the languages might have been and how they might have spread as well.
So we're talking about this interplay now between linguistics, archaeology, and genetics or paleogenetics. What conflicts arise when doing the science that mixes all of these fields?
Yeah, it's really, really difficult to discuss without setting up easily weaponizable conversations, I suppose. So here's the essential problem, is that language, culture, and genes can travel together, but they can also travel apart. And we've sort of touched on that, right? So if I migrate, I'm going to carry my culture and my language with me, but my children may have a different language and culture depending on, who I meet in the new place, who I marry in the new place, and so on. So these things change and they don't necessarily change together, but they can travel together. And so they're informative of each other, but they don't necessarily map onto each other one-to-one. And that's the difficult thing to convey, really. So when I say, as I did previously, that, knowing about prehistoric migration routes is really useful because it can tell us a lot about the splitting of languages and where languages went. That is true, but you also have to be very careful. So, for example, let me take a known historical example. The Greeks came into India. So did the Mughals. Both of them invaded India at different times. But they did not impose their languages on the Indian population at the time. They gave up their languages and took up the languages of the local population, who were much more numerous than them. And that's often happened through history. Just because a people came into a country doesn't necessarily mean, can mean, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they imposed their language on that country when they arrived, even if they became the ruling elite in that country. And that's where you have to be careful. You need to bring in, it's a possibility that you can consider, but then you need to bring in other sources of information to tell you whether it actually happened.
For you as a science journalist, how did you find yourself at the intersection of all of these fields and in this question?
Well, first of all, I've, as a science journalist, always been interested in language, but I suppose not so much in this kind of context. I was always interested in the brain, and I was always interested in the neuroscience of language, the psychology of language, and things, for example, how language is organized in the brain. But I happened to be lucky enough to be invited as a journalism fellow to the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico in the summer of 2022. And that is an institute that specializes in complexity science and how it might apply to any one of any scientific domain, really. So I was lucky enough to be surrounded by people from all scientific domains, physicists, biologists, social scientists, economists, historians, and among the mix of these brilliant people, much more brilliant than me, were some linguists. So I got chatting to these linguists, and they made me realize that the story, which basically, the origins of the Indo-European languages has been a puzzle that people have been obsessed with and have raked over for hundreds of years. But these linguists, my conversations with them made me realize that, in fact, in the last 10 years, because of ancient DNA, the story had been transformed. So then I started digging. That fascinated me. And I realized that the archaeologists and the geneticists and the linguists were talking to each other, but they weren't necessarily talking the same language. They said that to me themselves. Often they're having trouble understanding each other, having trouble realizing where the concepts they discuss meet. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because as we've already discussed, your linguistic identity, your cultural identity, and your genetic identity may be different. But I just wondered if, as a science journalist, as a complete outsider to all three fields, and somebody who's curious and somebody who knew that the general public, at least one part of it, shares my curiosity in these questions, then perhaps I could, translate them, if not to each other, then at least to people who are interested and don't necessarily need to think about it at the same technical level as the scientists who are doing so.
Yeah. So you said you translate. Do you feel as though you translate to a general audience, or do you also have a sense that you translate between the professionals as well?
Maybe in the same way that a journal like Nature publishes original research, but also because it's a general science journal, also translates the different scientific domains to each other. So in that sense, I suppose it does both jobs. I do both jobs. I can help, linguists understand what the archaeologists are bringing to their questions, and vice versa for the other two. But I can also convey what fascinating and extraordinary findings they're making to the general public. And connected, I suppose, another part of my job I saw as connecting to what we know about languages in history, what most people think they know about language in history, about what language the Romans spoke or what language was spoken in ancient India, that sort of thing. Connect those sort of unconnected parts in our general, the general public's, in my imagination before I got into this subject, and to connect it with what we know about, for example, mythology or ancient history or antiquity, and bring all those parts together into a whole that, if not seamless, definitely not seamless, because there's huge pockets of uncertainty in that story still, then at least one that makes sort of broad sense and hangs together in a broad way.
So Laura, you've written a whole book about this topic, but it's a book about a language that was never written, which
Never written down.
seems impossible. How do you write about a language that was never written?
Yeah. Well, I think I asked that question explicitly in the book. How do you study a language that has been dead in the case of Proto-Indo-European? So the parent language of this family. Linguists think it's been dead for 4,000 years and it was never written down, because at least in the part of the world where it was spoken, it predated writing. Writing, we think, is about 5,000 years old, so about the same age as this language, but it was invented in a different part of the world where different languages were spoken. So I suppose the short answer, as I say in the book, is with humility, and then the longer answer is with linguistics, archaeology, and genetics. The linguists can glean a lot about a dead language, even if it was never written down, from its living descendants. That's the core idea here in historical linguists, is that they can compare the living Indo-European languages and also the historical Indo-European languages, so things like Sanskrit, ancient Greek, Latin, that are dead today but were written down, so we know what they, if not what they sounded like, and you can compare all those languages. And because you know that languages can only evolve in restricted ways, that they can't go any which way they want, partly because of the restrictions imposed on the way we speak about this vocal tract that we share as humans and the cognitive machinery that we share as humans. Languages can't do anything. They can only evolve in certain ways, and they evolve according to what are called the sound laws. Right? And these sound laws guide the linguists as they compare the living and the Indo-European languages and help them to reconstruct what was the common ancestor that gave rise to those. So there is a sense in which you can reconstruct a language that was never written down, even if it has been dead for a long time. Not all of it, and not with certainty. There are lots of disputes. But for example, with Proto-Indo-European, there's a lexicon of about 1,600 words, or strictly speaking, stems of words that have been fairly reliably reconstructed that linguists would generally agree on. That constitutes really only the skeleton of the language as it was spoken. They would have had many more words. It's still really informative about, what was important to them, the kind of way that language worked, what it might have sounded like. Not in any definitive way. I mean, you're not going to get sort of all linguists agreeing about what one word sounded like. If you think about, Latin, a much younger language for which we have many texts, Linguists can still disagree about how certain Latin words may have been pronounced. Even Occitan, a language which is still spoken in bits of France, Spain, and Italy, we don't know how it was spoken from village to village in those areas in the 14th century. So, I'm not talking about any kind of uncertainty, but we still have very valuable insights into that language to the extent that linguists are fairly sure that it was a real language spoken by real people in a real place. And therefore, it's reasonable to ask questions about where it was spoken and when, and who those people were and what they believed and how they lived.
You mentioned that there are sort of patterns, sort of a flow to how languages change. What are some of those patterns or rules about how languages change?
Think about how a language is transmitted, okay? A baby is born and he or she picks up language initially from his or her parents. And typically what happens in that scenario is that the baby reproduces quite faithfully what their parent speaks to them, but usually introduces some tiny errors. That's just the natural process of language learning. And so language evolves just by that fact, just by the fact that it has to be transmitted from parent to child. So even if nobody moved in the world and everybody stayed in the same place, language would evolve by that mechanism. On top of that, of course, we have migration. We have the fact that you can learn language from people other than your parents, so you can speak several languages, borrow from each other. Languages can evolve by descent, but they can also borrow. If you don't have a word for something, but you want to learn a new concept and the neighboring language has a word for that concept, you may integrate that word into your language. And this has been happening since the beginning. And so, languages are constantly changing, and they have to. In a way, if you think about language as a tool that helps us adapt to our environment, which is what it is, it helps us adapt by, for example, cooperating with each other, then it must change because our context is always changing. Our environment is always changing. We're inventing new technologies for one thing, and therefore we need a new vocabulary to come up with it to keep up with the technologies, describe the technologies we're using all the time. This is exactly what happened in the ancient world. So, although it may be happening a bit faster now. So languages must evolve in order to remain useful, and languages expand and contract and live and die as long as their speakers are doing these things. So they are very dependent on the success, to use a loaded word, but success in the very simple sense of whether the people are alive and reproducing, then the language will be alive and reproducing. And a language that doesn't change will die.
And what are some of those patterns? I remember reading in your book about things like a hard CK sound transitioning to a softer S over time, things like that.
Yeah. So again, because of this sort of vocal apparatus that we're born with, that we've inherited as humans, there are sounds that are easier for us to make, and there are sound changes which are more likely than others in this process of language evolution. So, for example, a hard C is more likely to move towards a S or a sh sound than the other way around. This is where we come back to those sound laws that I described earlier, and there are many of them, and some of them are quite well known. So, for example, the brothers Grimm, who came up with all those fairy tales, went and collected all those fairy tales in Germany in the 19th century. What they were essentially doing was collecting a body of speech, essentially, in different German dialects, because their goal, they were philologists, which is another way of saying historical linguists, really, although more concerned with text than language historically, but they were collecting this because they wanted to be able to construct the Proto-Germanic language from all these dialects that were spoken in their day in Germany. They did this, and almost as a byproduct, they collected all these fairy tales, which are, of course, the thing that they're best known for today. But there is something called Grimm's Law, named after Jacob Grimm, one of the brothers, which describes a set of these sound changes. So, for example, basically, if you think about Latin and English are both languages that descend eventually at different speeds, but because Latin is older than English, but from the shared ancestor, the shared Indo-European ancestor. In Latin, you'll have a word like pater, father, and the P, reliably, it becomes an F in English. Or you'll have quad, which becomes what in English. So these relationships are quite stable. The P will always become an F in a set position relative to vowels. The QU sound will always become the WH sound in English. So that's one of Grimm's law. That's an example of sounds which can be fairly reliably predicted between those two languages.
So when reconstructing words that aren't written, would we take these laws backwards? We say,
Yes.
okay, now we have this. We can assume that we had the law sloping this change of the words, and we can take it back.
So you might do something like, so an example is a word for daughter. okay? Because a word for daughter, it's a word that refers to a member of the nuclear family. It tends to be a word that has remained quite stable over the evolution of the Indo-European languages, and not just the Indo-European languages, but that's the family we're concerned with, because it belongs to the so-called core vocabulary or core lexicon. That means tends to be concepts which are very important to us, that we talk about all the time, and that perhaps we don't want any misunderstanding, so they tend to be relatively stable. So, for example, in ancient Greek, the word, I'm not a linguist, so somebody may pick me up on my pronunciation, but the ancient Greek word for daughter was something like tugatera. The ancient Persian word was duster. The ancient English word, I think, was doctor. And so you can hear the similarities between these words, and the historical linguists will compare them across these languages, which they know from other reasons to be related, and they'll compare the sounds and they'll extrapolate backwards, knowing, for example, that a hard C is more likely, or the chronology is more likely hard C to soft S sound than the reverse, and they use these sound laws collectively to guide them in divining what would have been the common ancestor that could have given rise to these very different descendant words.
And they write it out like a tree, like a diagram.
So then one way of depicting that evolution is as a tree, yes, as a family tree with a root and then the branchings. It's a simplification, like all models, because if you think about it in real world, you have dialects shading into each other. The crisp branching is definitely a simplification, but it's a useful one nevertheless. As long as you realize that it's a simplification, it can be useful.
And Laura, how does our vocal apparatus affect the change of language too?
In the sense that certain sound combinations are more difficult than others. I mean, think of a k and a p will be difficult to put together unless, certainly at the beginning of a word, right? So you're not going to get that sound very often, but you might find it in the middle of a word if you have a change of syllable. So it's simply that, given this apparatus that we've got, some sound combinations are easier than others.
And so the easier sounds are sort of a gravitational pull.
Are more likely to arise. And also, if one sound is evolving for the reasons we've discussed, then it might, push its neighbor sounds with it, because one sound, might be pulled in a certain direction by its neighbor as it changes. But you could think of Kaiser to Caesar, the k to the s sound, come back to that.
Sure, yeah. And so these seem to be coded pretty well to the different sounds that we make and the way that works. It makes me think of, have you read Lolita?
Yeah.
Yeah, the intro to that, it's...
Oh my God, it's been some years. Remind me.
It's, he's saying her name, or he's writing it, but you can, if you read it aloud, you can feel kind of what he's getting at with the sensation of the name Lolita in his mouth. And
yeah.
It's Lolita, a trip of the tongue down the palate, landing at 3 on the teeth. Lolita. And you start to think about all the sensations that go into learning language, but then we automate them.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't think about where these words have come from. And often in etymology, you'll find that a word originally had some more concrete meaning, that there was a very direct relationship between the word and its meaning that then gradually got pulled apart and became more abstract. So, that's one of the joys of etymology, really. I mean, if you think about one of the examples I give in the book is the word focus, which originally comes from the Latin and it meant hearth, as in fireplace, right? But now, if you think about it, by focus, we tend to mean, the point to which attention is drawn, but people would have sat around and looked at the hearth. The evolution is understandable and logical, and yet today the meaning is more abstract than it would have been originally. And you can also think about something like onomatopoeia, where the word sounds like what it means. Another example I give in the book is the word barbarian, which originally meant, it originally meant somebody who spoke a foreign language, right? And it comes from essentially the sound that you hear when you hear a foreign language that you don't understand. You hear blah, blah, or baba, or rhubarb, right? And it became barbarian. And so that's an example of onomatopoeia, someone who speaks a foreign language, and it came to mean basically just the other.
So Laura, when they're coming up with these words that are historical, that are hypothetical, they weren't written, how hypothetical do you think they are?
Okay, so when the historical linguists write a reconstructed word, they have this convention of putting an asterisk in front of it to mark that it's hypothetical, that it's never been documented. Okay, so That's as good as we can get. They can be fairly confident that someone eventually said this word because there are many living descendants that sound very close to it, right? But they can't be sure because it's never been recorded. There have been instances of a document coming to light that, say, archaeologists have unearthed a clay tablet that records a hypothetical sound, for example, in a symbol. That has happened. It's very rare. But, for example, there was a Swiss linguist called Ferdinand de Saussure who posited a type of consonant that we don't have in English anymore called a laryngeal, because he said that its existence in ancient words explains how those words evolved over time. But it was hypothetical because he had no evidence that it existed until a Hittite tablet came to light, which recorded a laryngeal in a symbol. So that's one of those rare instances where he was vindicated, sadly for him, after his death, so he never got to see it. But, the hypothetical sound made sense of the evolution of certain words, and then he, bingo, the document came to light that proved that he was right about it.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, what does a laryngeal sound like? I can connect the dots on what a nasal sounds like or what a labial sounds like, but what does a laryngeal sound like?
I guess it's a sound, again, you're going to be testing my linguist's knowledge now, but it's a sound that comes from back, quite back in the throat, quite a throaty sound.
Yeah, yeah. We've talked a little bit about the Brothers Grimm. How do myths moving through culture help to answer these questions?
Because, so often linguists are also interested in mythology as well, because there's a very close connection between the two, which makes sense when you think that these were stories that were told by bards. They were transmitted orally. They weren't written down for a very long time. And so the language in which they were told, and simply in order to memorize them, the bards would have needed sort of stop phrases and certain rhythmic conventions or ways of memorizing these very long, often epic poems to perform and to adapt for their different audiences. So the stories and the language tended to change together. And what linguists can do is to apply the comparative method that I've described that they use to compare languages and extrapolate backwards in time to reconstruct older languages. They can do the same to myths. So they can take the basic, the basic units of myths, mythical tropes, or the simplest units, the notion of a dragon or a dragon slayer, say, and they can trace it across different poetic traditions and try and reconstruct what the sort of myth looked like, the original myth that gave rise to the descendant ones, which in some cases are still told today. We're still telling dragon stories today. And, it's probably very old, originally, the originally dragon myth and the dragon slayer myth. So there is, that those efforts do go on. And, you can find on the internet, for example, there's a linguist in Milan called Riccardo Ginevra, and he's recorded with some other linguists. You can find them on YouTube, versions of the original, as they've reconstructed it, Proto-Indo-European dragon slayer myth told in the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language. And I can tell you, when you listen to it, it can send shivers down your spine. You're listening to a story that is still familiar to us today, but as it was told in the language that it was told on the steppes of Eastern Europe 5,000.
Yes, I've heard you, I think, in another interview.
Probably.
Kind of reacting to...
I give it a lot of publicity because I think they're amazing.
Yeah, yeah. How'd they put that together?
I mean, by the comparative method, as I described it, they've reconstructed the language, they've reconstructed the myth, and then they've put the two together and performed it orally as it would have been performed.
So we talked about how words change and how there's sort of this pull that makes sense with the way that we make sounds and such. With the changing of myths, what are the steps or the rules or the sort of slope that we could follow to understand how myths change?
I mean, I think it's less rule-driven. If you think about, take a story like Faust, right? Or the core of Faust, where a man makes a pact with the devil. Let's talk about that as the basic core, the Faustian pact. I mean, every time that story is told, and it was told, originally the first recorded versions of it are medieval. There are people now saying that it's much older, maybe thousands of years old. But then you can track it through. Christopher Marlowe told a version, Goethe told a version, Thomas Mann told a version. You can find it in Hollywood films all over the place. The Little Mermaid, Hans Christian Andersen's famous fairy tale, has a Faustian pact at the core of it, because the mermaid falls in love with an earthly prince and offers to give up her life in the sea to become human and to live with him. So So the point is that there is a familiar element of all these things, but the story around it can change. And you can understand that, like when a bard who is worth his salt, any good bard, any good storyteller or Hollywood director will adapt an ancient story, an ancient trope to their audience. There are not really rules because you're adapting it to the audience that is in front of you with, elements that they will recognize, keeping that core that's familiar to us because we love familiar things, but we also want it to be told for our time, for our culture. And so that's the art of storytelling. And that's what we're grappling with. I'd say it's less of a scientific process than the effort to reconstruct the languages, which are a bit more guided by these sound laws and things. The kind of reconstruction of ancient myths may be more of an art than a science, perhaps. But that doesn't mean you can't say a lot about the forms of the myths as they were told in previous times, and linguists are trying to do that.
Yeah. So Tolkien was a philologist, and he writes this whole mythical structure, this whole world. How does the Proto-Indo-European language play into the work of Tolkien?
Yeah, so he was Norse expert, I think, certainly an Indo-European expert. I mean, this is a very pertinent question, in fact, because he understood that, languages are vehicles for cultures, and a language doesn't live without a culture, which includes a mythology. So for him, every living language had to have its associated mythology. And that's why he was quite rude about such constructed languages as Esperanto. He said, they haven't got a hope, basically. They're as dead as, Sanskrit or ancient Greek because they haven't got a mythology. They haven't got a living culture associated with them. And so
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just what does that mean that Esperanto was constructed?
I mean, it's a constructed language. It wasn't a natural language. It was a language that was invented by people who wanted peace in Europe and thought that they could help bring it about and bring the end to wars by inventing a language that would sort of be an amalgam of many actual languages and that people would be able to pick up easily, and therefore would become a kind of universal language and therefore a vehicle for, universal love and understanding. I mean, Esperanto, many people still learn and speak it, and many people get offended when you say it didn't really work, but I think that it didn't really work.
Mm-hmm.
And Tolkien would tell you that the reason was that there was no actual living culture associated with it. It was a patchwork of, it was patched together. I mean, it was deliberately patched together. But I think he would have believed that there was something organic about a language and that it came with a culture. Even if both are changing, it came with always associated with a culture. And perhaps you see that most clearly in the myths that people tell and the language that they tell them in. So he wrote his stories famously as a vehicle, or he invented his languages as a vehicle for his stories, or the other way around. Anyway, he wanted the two to go together.
Yeah. And how do you think that worked out for him? I mean, we don't speak the language of Tolkien writing, at least not many of us, maybe at some comic conventions and things.
No, but don't they add enormously to his stories and make them live?
They do.
And, many Tolkien fans have learned those languages and delight in them. So, yeah.
Yeah, and as much as we do put out his work and culture, in a way we are speaking his language. I mean, his books are everywhere, his movies are everywhere.
And I mean, he definitely made his philology, his philological knowledge work for him because his invented languages had a lot in common with real Indo-European languages. I mean, the example I think of is the dragon's name, Smaug or Smorg. I mean, there is a reconstructed in a Proto-Indo-European word, which I think it sounded something like smirk, and it referred to the kind of gliding action of a serpent, and probably by euphemism came to become the actual name of a serpent at some point. So, serpents being the kind of etymological background of dragons, he knew what he was doing. It wasn't randomly picked.
Yeah, I've had a sort of a Tolkien scholar on the show, and he talks about how if you know what Tolkien was getting after, you can even see sort of the inside jokes that he was tucking into his words.
Yeah.
So he had sort of a debate with C.S. Lewis about myth and allegory, and so he gives the armor of mithril, mithril, but it's real myth. And it's also true silver, and the layers
so
that he's playing.
There are layers within layers, and for people with different levels of knowledge would discover, treats like a Kinder Surprise wrapped within his stories. But even those who don't have that knowledge can have a sense of familiarity from the invented words that he comes up with because he was drawing on Indo-European tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started to talk about how you could chart the changes of words and things. How do languages evolve? Is it branching? Is it families? How do we track the language itself?
So yeah, languages can change through inheritance. So as we said, they can evolve, they're constantly evolving. So, you're going to get this kind of vertical process of inheritance where, for example, French and Spanish evolve out of Latin. And then they can also change by horizontal processes. So borrowing, we also referred to that earlier. So the language can borrow words or grammatical structures from neighboring languages. And so they have these two mechanisms of changing, of evolving. And one of the kind of key challenges for historical linguists is to differentiate those processes. And they do have methods for doing that. Again, the sound laws come in very importantly here because the sound laws govern the inheritance process, but not necessarily the borrowing process. And so that helps you. They help you to distinguish the two. But it's one of the reasons that we can't say very much about languages before about 10,000 years ago, because we just don't have the data to be able to distinguish those processes. So it becomes very difficult to know whether languages are similar because they're related to each other, because they share a common ancestor, or because they simply borrowed from each other. So our ability to extrapolate backwards and reconstruct only goes back about 10,000 years, which does sound a lot, and it's enough to get at the origin of the Indo-European languages, for example. But when you think that humanity has been around for 300,000 years and that most linguists think that we've been speaking for at least 100,000 years of that, then we really are, we're not going back very far at all in the story of language. We're looking in the very near linguistic universe.
You mentioned the data and collecting the data. How has the war in Ukraine affected the ability to collect data around your question?
Yeah, around the Indo-European question. So, I'd say that the bulk of the evidence now points to this so-called steppe hypothesis, which places the origin of the Indo-European languages in the steppes of Eastern Europe, what is now Ukraine and Russia, and therefore in, sadly, a war zone. Linguists obviously can go on studying these languages serenely. Nothing interferes with their work. Although interestingly, there are those who've been studying the Ukrainian and Russian languages and saying that they are spinning apart quite fast at the moment by conscious processes because the Ukrainians don't want to speak Russian anymore and so on. So those languages are accelerating opposite directions very fast. But if you're interested in archaeology or genetics, which, contribute hugely to understanding the early parts of this story, then you are in difficulty at the moment because many of the archaeological sites in Ukraine are, if not destroyed, limits, maybe mined. Many of the museums have been destroyed as well, and there's a big fight going on about, how to interpret the contents of those museums to the winner the spoils. And part of any war is rewriting history, unfortunately. So that's going on at the moment. And same with genetics, obviously. You can't take, no more samples are coming out of the war zone at the moment. But that doesn't mean that people can't work on samples that came out before the war. And so papers are still coming out. But obviously there's going to be a rupture at some point because there would have been, let's hope only a few years. Let's hope this war is over soon. But people aren't collecting from those places anymore. People are not on the ground, apart from a few very brave individuals who are still trying to protect and even work in those sites. Very little is coming out of them.
And Laura, a language clarification. When you say that sites are mined, you don't mean mined like mining for gold. You mean like landmines?
Sorry, landmines. Yes,
through
landmines. Yeah, landmines.
So data collection there mean not for the foreseeable future.
Not for the foreseeable future.
Unless you have some sort of ordnance disposal team with you.
Exactly.
It's going to be much too much.
Exactly. And even I'm told that the kurgans, the burial mounds in the steppes within the war zone, are being used for defense. So, if they haven't already been excavated, they may be suffering severe damage at the moment.
Those are the sites where it was stacked very tall with the burial.
Yeah. The burial mounds, which are extremely visible in the flatness of the steppe, and which are often the only trace left by the nomadic herders, pastoralists who are speakers of the Proto-Indo-European language. By the way, I wanted to say, in answer to something earlier you asked me, that Proto-Indo-European is, of course, a bit of a technical name and a bit of a mouthful, but that's because we don't know what its actual speakers called it, because they didn't write it down.
Yeah. To this point about Russia, Ukraine, you have a Russian proverb at the very end of your book. The past is a lighthouse, not a port. What did you mean by choosing that?
I meant that you can't hove too closely to history in the present. No, I think a lot of the politics that's going on in the east of Europe at the moment is to do with trying to reclaim some kind of historical vision of, for example, the Russian Empire, and that, the present is not the past. history is interesting in explaining to us how we came to be who we are and where we might go in future, but it's never repeated word for word or empire for empire.
Do we know about Vladimir Putin's view on the past and language?
Well, we know what he's told us, and he published an essay online in, I think it was 2021, referred to it in the book, where he elaborated a little bit on his vision of the history of Ukraine and Russia as he saw it. And I think it becomes fairly clear from that essay that he thinks of Ukraine as a part of Russia historically, and the Ukrainian language is a dialect of the Russian language. Now, the definition of a language is inherently political. So these are very difficult distinctions to make, and they don't always make sense. But if Russian has a right to be called a language, then I think Ukrainian does. And of course, again, come back to the central point that language and culture and genes have a lot in common, but they do not necessarily always travel together. And so a cultural identity, a national identity can be very different from a linguistic identity and an ethnic identity. These things overlap, but they don't necessarily map onto each other.
On that note, what do you notice as patterns in the difference between your English and my American English?
I mean, I can hear an accent and you can hear an accent, and both of us think we are speaking without accents, right?
Absolutely.
There are also vocabulary differences, sidewalk, pavement, all the famous ones. And probably our languages are moving slowly apart, although languages can also converge. This is one of the problems with the family tree model of a language evolution, which suggests only divergence, really. But languages can come together again. And I think, politics and culture and language can sort of feed off each other in a feedback loop, right? So, at some point, the first American English dictionary was published, and that would have reinforced the concept of American identity being different from British identity, and the language would have then become different. There was a fascinating study which showed that often the fastest divergence of two separating dialects is just after they've separated, as if two groups of people, their dialects are moving apart, and then they realize consciously, we are different from them. Now we're going to stamp our identity on these two dialects, and now we're going to consciously change them. So they change fastest in that period when the identities have consciously been split. And that obviously happened in the past between American English and British English, and maybe happening in an accentuated way between Ukraine and Russian at the moment, because there's many similarities between those languages too. And there are times in history when the similarities have been more important than the differences. And then there have been times of war when the differences have come to the fore.
In our globalized world, what do you think would be pushing English in different directions? And it seems that English is everywhere. Watch Formula One racing, and the drivers are from all over the world, but they all speak English on the radios. So it sounds the same. This is a global language. What's pushing it apart?
Yeah. So English really is a case apart at the moment because it's the first truly global language. I mean, it may not be the only one for very long. That will depend on geopolitical events in the future. But for now, it's the only one. And that is fascinating because obviously people on different continents are speaking at people from very different cultures, and they are taking it in different directions. So in some ways, it's undergoing processes similar to what Latin underwent when it exploded into the Romance languages, because the Roman Empire got so big and people at different in different parts of that empire were speaking dialects, and they weren't necessarily in contact with each other. So there was nothing keeping their dialects together, and they just went off in different directions. To some extent, that's what's happening with English. I mean, I've even seen different Englishes be subtitled to each other on TV. The assumption being that if you speak, say, a Caribbean English and a British English, you won't necessarily understand each other. But that would be the beginning of, two different languages forming. But English is not the same as Latin. For example, most of the subjects of the Roman Empire would have been illiterate, whereas that's not the case today. Most English speakers are literate, and we have a single standard English written language that we all share. So that is keeping our English together at some level. So the spoken dialects may be separating, but you have this layer in the form of the standard written English, which is keeping it together. So that's not to say that it won't split into different languages at some point, but let's say there's more of a force keeping it, a gluing force keeping it together. So perhaps it'll happen more slowly. It's very difficult to predict, and it's difficult to find a linguist who will predict that, because there's so many different forces impinging on what will happen to English now and in the future.
And in this field today, you write about the very old and the very new cutting edge science. Who are the big players in this field going into the future?
I mean, there are several schools of Indo-European linguists who are, essentially, I'm talking about a linguistic question, so they come first. But if you like, the linguists have been studying this question for several hundred years, so maybe there won't be so many huge surprises to come in their domain. Where the interesting work is happening is at the frontiers of linguistics with these other sciences, especially genetics, because that's the newest, ancient DNA, but it's really in the crosstalk of these three fields. So, I mean, ancient DNA being a relatively young field, it has its stars. People like David Reich at Harvard, people like the Copenhagen group in Denmark, and there's and also a very big and important and exciting group in Germany, Max Planck. So these three groups are not just in terms of ancient languages, but in many other aspects of our history and prehistory driving forward knowledge. But again, I think it's at the frontier of where they're working with the archaeologists who are interested in the Bronze Age, especially that's the age, in which the Proto-Indo-European language is spoken, and with the linguists interested in Indo-European, where they come together is where the really exciting findings are coming. But again, I think, even if the kind of tone of my book deliberately was one of, probability, there's very little certainty in this story. We're talking about scenarios that are more probable than the other scenarios, ordering them in order of probability. I still think that probably the main contours of this story are in place now, and it's a question of filling in the pockets of uncertainty. But I would say that, in terms of the steppe hypothesis, that these languages having their origins in the steppe, and how they diffuse to east towards India, west towards Europe, the broad outline of that story is in place now and probably won't move. It's the smaller details, the greater resolution that may change in the years to come, and possibly in exciting ways.
And what needs to happen to fill in those?
Archaeologists need to keep digging. Geneticists need more samples, and there needs to be more crosstalk between them, with each other, and with the linguists.
And then, so the linguists, are the linguists sort of the hive? Do they collect this from these different spheres and then work it through that comparative method that we talked about earlier?
Yeah. So I guess that because we're talking about languages, their theories are the ones that lead the game, if you like, and then those theories which they come up with to explain with their specialist linguistic knowledge, how a long dead ancestor might have given rise to the languages we speak today. So they come up with theories for that, and then those theories can be tested against what the archaeologists know or what the geneticists know to see which fits the other facts most closely. But we always have the same caveats, for example, that the culture doesn't necessarily tell you about the language. The language might have traveled separately from the culture or separately from the genes. So we always have to bear in mind that, we're talking about probabilities, but something different might have happened in reality.
Well, Laura Spinney, before we get to our last topic, for people who want to see more of where this is going and check out your book, where should they look for you online?
So my book is published by Bloomsbury in the US and William Collins in the UK. You can get it on Amazon and all good bookshops. And I have that's the American version. Thank you. The paperback will be out in the spring. The hardback came out last spring. There are many foreign language versions to come. And I have my website where all my work as a science journalist and as a writer is collected. It's www.lauraspinney.com.
Excellent. We'll put some links in the description for everyone to check out. And Laura Spinney, the last topic is really you. First of all, I'd like to know, what's it been like to be in this field, to write this book and to sort of stake your claim in it?
Well, I was the ultimate barbarian. I came into this with my curiosity and my stupid questions. And they, the linguists particularly looked at me like, why on earth, who is this? And why on earth is she interested in our subject? And so I tried to explain, what you do seems specialist and technical to you, but it somehow connects with the story of how I speak this language that I speak. And so I'd love you to explain it to me. I think they thought I was a curious presence, but they got used to me after a while. And it was one of the most intense research experiences of my life, trying to cross-reference these three sciences when they don't necessarily speak the same language. But absolutely fascinating, to the point that I was very depressed when I had to hand over the manuscript and wished I could have stayed in that maelstrom of prehistory.
Well, that leads to my last question, which is, what's next for you? Are you going to come back to the maelstrom, or are you going to move on to something else? What's going on?
I can't quite let go. Ancient DNA has blasted open prehistory in such fascinating ways. Language is just one of them. My previous book was about a pandemic, so-called Spanish flu of 1918. The theme of disease is one that ancient DNA is shedding a huge amount of light on now. Pandemics in prehistory, which we knew nothing about before. So I remain fascinated by prehistory. I'm fascinated by language, but in terms of what I will sink my teeth into next, I haven't quite decided.
Okay. Well, whatever that is, Laura Spinney, for doing the work that you do to translate between these fields, to clarify things for a general audience, thank you so much.
And thank you for your questions. Excellent conversation. I enjoyed it.